September 19th, 1944, 6:58 in the morning, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Private First Class. Paul Bulge crouches in a foxhole 50 yards inside the tree line. Above him, the forest canopy is so thick it blocks out the sun. The air smells like wet pine, rotting leaves, and something else. Something wrong. Death. Bulge grips his M1 Garand and listens. The forest is silent. No birds, no wind, just silence. Then comes the sound. A distant whistle, growing louder. Artillery. Bulge dives flat into his hole. The shell detonates in the treetops 100 feet above. The explosion is muffled by branches, but the shrapnel isn't. Steel fragments rain down like lethal hail, shredding leaves, bark, and flesh. A man screams 30 yards away, then silence again. Bulge realizes the terrible truth. In this forest, you can't take cover from the sky. This is the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, the longest battle ever fought by the United States Army, and it should never have happened. By mid-September 1944, Allied forces had liberated Paris and driven the Germans back to their own border. The Siegfried Line, Germany's fortified western frontier, stretched from Holland to Switzerland. American commanders studied maps and identified a critical objective: the Roer River dams, deep in German territory. If the Germans held those dams, they could flood the entire river valley, drowning any Allied advance. To reach the dams, the U.S. First Army would need to cross 50 square miles of dense woodland called the Hürtgen Forest. It sat along the Belgian-German border, just south of Aachen. On the map, it looked insignificant, a small patch of green between Allied lines and the Roer. General Courtney Hodges, commanding First Army, made the decision. Send the 9th Infantry Division through the forest. Capture the town of Schmidt, which overlooked the dams. Simple, direct. Except nothing about Hürtgen would be simple. The Hürtgen Forest is not one forest. It's a 50-square-mile killing ground of interconnected woodlands, steep ravines, and narrow trails. The trees, mostly fir and pine, grow so densely that sunlight barely penetrates. The canopy rises 80 to 100 feet. Below, thick underbrush chokes the ground. Visibility averages 30 yards. In some areas, 10. The terrain is a nightmare. Hills rise sharply, then plunge into gorges carved by icy streams. Fire breaks, narrow dirt roads cut through the forest, offer the only routes for vehicles. And those fire breaks were pre-registered by German artillery. Every intersection, every turn, every clearing. German gunners knew the exact coordinates. Rain turned the forest floor into boot-sucking mud. Temperatures dropped as autumn became winter. Snow fell. Men froze in their foxholes. And the trees, those goddamn trees, became the enemy. Because German artillery didn't need to hit you directly. They just needed to hit the trees above you. Tree bursts. That's what soldiers called them. When an artillery shell detonates in the canopy, the explosion sends steel fragments and wooden splinters downward in a cone of death. The fragments travel at supersonic speed. They shred anything beneath: equipment, trees, bodies. A man lying flat in a foxhole, normally safe from airbursts, becomes exposed because the shrapnel falls straight down. Veterans quickly learned, in Hürtgen, standing up was safer than lying down. The psychological effect was devastating. Every incoming shell brought terror. You couldn't dig deep enough. You couldn't take cover. You could only wait and hope the shell didn't detonate directly above you. One veteran later wrote, "In the Hürtgen, we learned to pray to trees. We prayed they'd absorb the shrapnel. We prayed the shell would hit the tree next to us, not ours. We prayed the forest would protect us, but the forest killed us." The Germans understood this. They exploited it, and American casualties mounted. The first American unit into Hurtgen was the 9th Infantry Division. They attacked on September 19, 1944. The objective: capture the village of Hurtgen, then push northeast to Schmidt and the Ruhr dams. The division's commander, Major General Lewis Craig, was optimistic. His men were veterans of North Africa and Sicily. They'd fought in hedgerows. They'd seen combat. How hard could a forest be? The answer came within hours. German defenders from the 275th Infantry Division had fortified every trail, every firebreak, every high point. They'd placed mines, thousands of mines, along paths and under leaves. They'd strung barbed wire between trees. They'd dug bunkers into hillsides, invisible until you were on top of them. And they waited. When the 9th Division advanced, the Germans opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, artillery. The Americans couldn't see the enemy. They could only hear the bullets snapping through branches and feel the shrapnel raining down. The 9th Division's 39th Infantry Regiment led the assault. By the end of the first day, they'd advanced 1,000 yards. It cost them 29 casualties. The next day, 300 yards, 60 casualties. The day after, 200 yards, 112 casualties. The pattern became clear. Every yard gained cost blood. By October 6th, after 3 weeks of fighting, the 9th Division had pushed 3,000 yards into the forest. The cost: 4,581 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, plus nearly 1,000 non-battle casualties, men evacuated for trench foot, pneumonia, combat exhaustion, mental breakdown. The division had gained less than 2 miles, at a rate of 1.5 casualties per yard. One soldier wrote home, "We measure our progress in feet, not miles, and we count our dead in dozens, not ones and twos." The forest was devouring them, and they hadn't even reached Schmidt yet. Inside Hurtgen, time lost meaning. Days blended into nights. The canopy blocked sunlight, so soldiers moved through perpetual twilight. Navigation was nearly impossible. Compasses went haywire near metal fragments embedded in trees. Maps showed trails that no longer existed, erased by shelling. Units became separated. Entire squads vanished. Some were killed, some were captured, some simply got lost, wandered deeper into the forest, and were never seen again. One veteran recalled, "Every night men left their foxholes to relieve themselves. Some never came back. We'd find them in the morning, dead from a mine, a sniper, or just gone. Disappeared. The forest swallowed them." Supply was a nightmare. Jeeps bogged down in mud. Mules, yes, mules, were brought in to carry ammunition and rations, but mules don't do well under artillery fire. They panic. They bolt. Supplies piled up at the forest edge while men at the front ran out of food, water, ammunition. Wounded soldiers lay for hours, sometimes days, before stretcher bearers could reach them. The Germans defending Hurtgen were not elite troops. Many belonged to Volksgrenadier divisions, units filled with older men, teenagers, and soldiers recovering from wounds on the Eastern Front. But they didn't need to be elite. The forest did half their work. General Friedrich Köchling commanded the German 81st Corps, responsible for the Hurtgen sector. After the war, in American captivity, he gave a lengthy interview about the battle. His words are chilling. "We could not believe the Americans were attacking through the forest. It made no sense. The forest negated all their advantages: air power, tanks, mobility. Why not bypass it? Why not go around?" We asked ourselves this question every day, and every day the Americans came, and every day we killed them. Not because we were better soldiers, but because the forest was our ally. Köchling estimated that for every German casualty in Hurtgen, the Americans suffered 2. sometimes 3. He was right. By late October, the 9th Infantry Division was spent. They'd lost over 4,500 men in 6 weeks. On October 16th, they were pulled from the line. The battered division limped out of the forest, leaving unfinished the mission they'd started. Now it was the 28th Infantry Division's turn. The 28th was a Pennsylvania National Guard unit, the Keystone Division. They'd fought in Normandy, they'd liberated Paris. They were confident. Their objective was the same: capture Schmidt and the Ruhr dams. The attack began on November 2nd. Intelligence assured them German resistance was light. Intelligence was wrong. Waiting in Hürtgen were fresh German units, including elements of the 116th Panzer Division. The 28th walked into a buzzsaw. On November 2nd, the division's 109th Infantry Regiment attacked toward the town of Germeter. They advanced 300 yards in 2 days, then hit a minefield nobody knew existed, a massive barrier the Germans called the Wild Pig. The regiment ground to a halt. Casualties mounted. By November 4th, the 109th had gained 1 mile. They'd lost hundreds of men, and they weren't even halfway to Schmidt. The 112th Infantry Regiment fared worse. Their mission: clear the Kaul River Valley, capture the village of Wassenach, and push on to Schmidt. The Kaul Valley was a nightmare. A steep-sided gorge with a single trail winding down across a creek, then back up the far side. The trail was so narrow that tanks had to be winched down by cables. At the bottom, a bridge, or what remained of one, crossed the Kaul River. German artillery zeroed in on that bridge. Every vehicle, every supply truck, every ambulance that tried to cross became a target. The regiment fought for 5 days to take Wassenach. They captured it on November 7th. Then the Germans counterattacked. Panzers, German tanks, rolled down the main street, firing into buildings at point-blank range. American infantry had no anti-tank weapons. They retreated. Wassenach changed hands 3 times in 48 hours. By November 10th, the town was in ruins. Both sides had taken staggering losses, and Schmidt, the original objective, remained in German hands. The Battle of Schmidt became the 28th Division's Golgotha. On November 5th, elements of the 110th Infantry Regiment actually reached Schmidt. They captured the town. For about 36 hours, it looked like victory. Then the Germans counterattacked with 2 panzer divisions, tanks, self-propelled guns, artillery. The Americans, isolated and low on ammunition, were overrun. Companies were destroyed. Entire battalions ceased to exist. Survivors fled back across the Kaul Valley in chaos, abandoning equipment, weapons, even wounded comrades. One lieutenant wrote in his after-action report, "We held Schmidt for a day and a half. Then the panzers came. We had nothing to stop them. Nothing. Men threw their rifles away and ran. I don't blame them. It was run or die." By November 9th, the 28th Division had been mauled. Over 6,000 casualties in 1 week. The division was withdrawn. Schmidt remained in German hands. The Ruhr dams remained operational, and Hürtgen kept killing. Between November and December, 4 more American divisions entered the forest. The 4th Infantry Division, the 8th Infantry Division, the 83rd Infantry Division, elements of the 5th Armored Division. Each division attacked. Each division bled. Each division failed to achieve its objective. The 4th Division attacked in mid-November. They gained 2 miles in 3 weeks. Cost over 5,000 casualties, including 1,500 dead. The 8th Division relieved them in late November. They attacked toward the town of Hürtgen itself, the village that gave the forest its name. House-to-house fighting, snipers in cellars, minefields in gardens. It took the 8th Division 2 weeks to capture a village of 200 buildings. Cost over 4,000 casualties. Meanwhile, the Germans rotated units in and out of the line. Fresh troops replaced exhausted ones. They took losses, yes, but they held. And every day they held was a day gained, a day closer to winter, a day closer to Hitler's planned counteroffensive in the Ardennes. December brought snow. The forest, already dark, became a frozen hell. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Men in foxholes developed trench foot, a condition where flesh literally rots from prolonged exposure to cold and wet. Soldiers unable to remove their boots for days found their feet black, swollen, gangrenous. Evacuation for trench foot became so common that commanders threatened courts-martial for self-inflicted wounds. But the feet weren't self-inflicted. The forest was doing it. Combat exhaustion, what we now call PTSD, reached epidemic levels. Men broke. They stared into space, unresponsive. They trembled uncontrollably. They refused to move, even under direct orders. Medics evacuated hundreds with diagnoses like acute anxiety reaction or battle fatigue. There was no shame in it. Hurtgen broke everyone eventually. It was just a question of when. One chaplain wrote, "I've seen men pray before battle. I've seen men pray during battle. But in Hurtgen, I saw men pray for death, because death was preferable to one more day in that forest." And still, the High Command ordered attacks. Why? Because the Roer dams had to be captured before any crossing of the Roer River could begin. And crossing the Roer was necessary to advance on Cologne and the Rhine. The logic was sound. The execution was catastrophic. General James Gavin, a paratrooper who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division and later wrote extensively about the war, offered this assessment in a 1979 article. The battle for Hurtgen Forest was one of the most costly and tragic blunders of the war. We sacrificed thousands of men to take a forest that we could have bypassed. We fought the Germans on terrain that negated every advantage we possessed. We did this because senior commanders failed to recognize that taking Hurtgen was unnecessary. The dams could have been approached from the south, avoiding the forest entirely. But we didn't, and men died for no reason. Gavin's criticism is harsh, but it's supported by post-war German testimony. Field Marshal Walter Model, who commanded German forces in the West, told interrogators after the war, "Hurtgen was a gift. The Americans insisted on attacking where we were strongest. We could not have asked for a better defensive position." The human cost is almost incomprehensible. Between September 19, 1944, and February 10, 1945, a span of roughly 5 months, American forces suffered approximately 33,000 casualties in Hurtgen. Some estimates push that number to 55,000 when non-battle losses are included. 33,000. That's roughly the population of a small American city, all killed, wounded, captured, or broken in 50 square miles of forest. To put it in perspective, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, cost roughly 10,000 Allied casualties on June 6, 1944. Hurtgen, over 5 months, cost 3 times that. And Hurtgen has no monuments, no museums, no movies. It's a footnote. German casualties were lower, but still severe. Approximately 28,000 killed, wounded, or captured. But Germany rotated units, so individual divisions didn't suffer the same sustained attrition the Americans did. And Germany held the forest until the Allies chose to stop attacking. In tactical terms, Hurtgen was a German defensive victory. In strategic terms, it was meaningless. Both sides lost. The battle for Hurtgen officially ended in early February 1945. Not because the Americans captured the Roer dams, though they eventually did, but because the German Ardennes counteroffensive in December had shifted priorities. The Battle of the Bulge drew resources away from Hurtgen. When the Bulge was contained in January, American forces returned. This time, they bypassed Hurtgen and struck directly at the dams from the south. The dams were captured after several days of fighting. The forest, that cursed stretch of woodland that had consumed so many lives, was simply left behind, isolated, irrelevant. By February, snow covered the battlefield. Beneath the snow lay bodies, thousands of bodies, American, German, frozen, unrecovered. When local civilians returned to the region after the war, they found a landscape of horror, unexploded ordnance, skeletons in foxholes, equipment rusting in the mud. The forest itself was dead, trees splintered by shell fire, the ground poisoned by explosives. It took decades to clear the mines. To this day, ordnance is still found. Veterans of Hurtgen rarely spoke of it. When they did, their words carried a bitterness absent from other battles. Private Paul Bulge, who survived the entire campaign, wrote in his memoir, "I've been asked many times which battle was the worst. Normandy? The Bulge? My answer is always the same: Hurtgen, because in Normandy we could see the enemy. In the Bulge we understood the objective, but in Hurtgen we saw nothing and understood nothing. We just died, and for what?" Another veteran, interviewed in the 1990s, put it more bluntly: "Hurtgen wasn't a battle, it was a murder. We were sent into a forest we couldn't navigate, to fight an enemy we couldn't see, to capture an objective we didn't need. And when we failed, they sent more men, and more, and more, until the forest was full of corpses, ours and theirs, and nobody won." The anger is justified, because Hurtgen represents something uncomfortable, a failure of generalship, a failure to recognize when a mission is not worth the cost. The German perspective offers cold validation of American fears. After the war, German officers were extensively interrogated about Hurtgen. Their accounts are consistent. General Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, told his interrogators, "The fighting in Hurtgen denied the Americans the advantages of their Air Force and armored units. We could not understand why they persisted. If they had bypassed the forest and attacked the dams from open terrain to the south, we could not have stopped them. But they chose the forest, and the forest destroyed them." Another German officer, whose name was redacted in declassified documents, was even more direct. "Every morning we expected the Americans to stop attacking, to realize the forest was a trap, to pull back and find another route. Every morning they came again. We felt pity, and we killed them, because that was our duty, but we pitied them." This is the tragedy of Hurtgen. The Germans knew it was a slaughter. The Americans on the ground knew it was a slaughter. But the High Command kept ordering attacks, because the plan said so, because the objective mattered, because stopping would mean admitting failure. The weather made everything worse. November and December 1944 were unusually cold and wet. Rain turned the forest floor into a swamp. Men developed immersion foot, a condition where constant wetness causes tissue damage. By late November, trench foot casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units. The 4th Infantry Division evacuated more men for trench foot than for gunshot wounds. December brought snow. Temperatures dropped into the teens Fahrenheit. Men in summer weight uniforms froze. Supply lines, already strained, collapsed under snow and ice. Ammunition didn't reach the front. Food didn't reach the front. Medical supplies didn't reach the front. And still, the attacks continued. Men attacked with frostbitten feet, with empty stomachs, with rifles that jammed from mud and ice. They attacked because orders said attack, and they died. One battalion surgeon wrote in his report, "I treated men with trench foot so severe their boots had to be cut off. The flesh came with the leather. I treated men with hypothermia, pneumonia, and combat exhaustion. I treated men with wounds I couldn't explain, shell fragments embedded in places shrapnel couldn't reach. The forest was killing us in ways I'd never seen. The forest also killed in silence. Mines. Hurtgen was laced with mines. Anti-personnel mines. Anti-tank mines. Booby traps. The Germans placed them everywhere, on trails, under leaves, attached to tripwires stretched between trees. American engineers tried to clear paths, but the forest was too dense. Mines laid in September were still active in December. Soldiers learned to walk in single file, stepping in the footprints of the man ahead. But that only worked if the first man survived. One veteran recalled, "We lost a lieutenant to a mine. He stepped on it, didn't kill him instantly, just blew off his legs below the knee. He bled out before we could get him to an aid station. That happened a lot. You'd hit a mine, and your buddies couldn't reach you because there might be more mines around you, so you'd just lay there, screaming, bleeding, until you stopped." Another killer. Booby traps. Germans rigged grenades to corpses, to abandoned equipment, to doors of houses. Americans learned to touch nothing, but in the chaos of combat, men forgot and died. The psychological toll rivaled the physical. In most battles, soldiers experience periods of combat followed by rest. In Hurtgen, there was no rest. The forest was the front line. Every yard was contested. There was no rear area, no safe zone. Artillery could hit anywhere. Snipers could kill anywhere. Mines could detonate anywhere. Men lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, and the human mind can only sustain that for so long. Combat exhaustion rates soared. By December, entire companies were rendered ineffective not by casualties, but by psychiatric breakdown. Men refused to leave their foxholes. They trembled uncontrollably. They wept. They stared into space, catatonic. Battalion aid stations filled with men diagnosed as psychoneurotic. There was no treatment, no therapy, just evacuation to rear area hospitals where they joined thousands of others. One psychiatrist assigned to First Army wrote, "Hurtgen broke men faster than any battle I've studied. The combination of environmental stress, constant danger, and apparent futility created a psychological crucible. Many never recovered." And through it all, the forest burned. Phosphorus shells, used by both sides for smoke and incendiary effects, ignited the underbrush. Fires spread through the dry lower branches, creating walls of flame. Men burned alive, unable to escape through the dense vegetation. The smell of burning wood mixed with burning flesh. In some sectors, firefights paused as both sides retreated from the flames, then resumed when the fires died. In summer 1947, 2 years after the war ended, unexploded phosphorus ammunition in Hurtgen spontaneously ignited during a heat wave. Fires raged for weeks. Local fire brigades couldn't extinguish them. The forest burned until October, when autumn rains finally drowned the flames. Even in peacetime, Hurtgen killed. The forest had been poisoned by war, and it would take decades to heal. Why did American commanders persist? Historians debate this endlessly. Some argue the Roer dams were a legitimate strategic objective. If the Germans flooded the river, any Allied advance would stall. Capturing the dams required controlling the high ground around Schmidt, and reaching Schmidt required crossing Hurtgen. Others argue the entire operation was based on flawed assumptions. The dams could have been neutralized by airstrikes, or approached from the south through more favorable terrain. The forest itself had no intrinsic value. But once American forces were committed, pride took over. Generals don't like to admit failure, so they reinforced failure, sent more divisions, more men, more attacks. hoping the next push would break through. It never did. Not until the strategic situation changed, the Battle of the Bulge, and resources were diverted elsewhere. By then, Hurtgen had already claimed its 33,000 casualties. And for what? A forest that was bypassed 2 months later. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive, began on December 16, 1944. It struck the Ardennes, just south of Hurtgen. Some historians argue there's a direct connection. Hitler planned the Ardennes offensive throughout autumn 1944. Every day the Germans held Hurtgen was a day they gained to assemble forces for the Bulge. Field Marshal Model explicitly stated this in his post-war interrogations. He said, "Hurtgen served its purpose. It delayed the Americans. It bled them. It exhausted divisions that might otherwise have been positioned to stop our Ardennes attack." In that sense, Hurtgen was Phase 1 of the Bulge. If Model is correct, and German documents support his claim, then Hurtgen was a strategic German success. The Americans played into German hands. They attacked where Germany was strong. They sustained casualties Germany could afford to inflict. And when the Bulge came, American forces were weaker, less prepared, and less capable of responding. The irony is bitter. American soldiers died in Hurtgen to capture objectives that facilitated the very offensive that nearly broke the Allied line in December. The battle's end brought no closure. Unlike other battles, there was no decisive victory, no flag raising, no surrender ceremony. The fighting in Hurtgen just stopped. Units were pulled out, replaced, pulled out again. The forest remained contested until February, when American forces finally bypassed it and struck the dams from the south. By then, Hurtgen was a graveyard. Thousands of bodies lay unrecovered in the snow. American graves registration units began the grim work of retrieval in spring 1945. They found corpses in foxholes, trenches, ravines. Many were unidentifiable, dog tags lost, faces unrecognizable. They were buried as unknown. German dead received less care. They were interred in mass graves near the forest. To this day, remains are occasionally found. In 2003, a German soldier's skeleton was discovered in a foxhole, his rifle still clutched in skeletal hands. In 2015, an American dog tag was found by a hiker. The soldier was identified. His family, 60 years later, finally knew where he died. Modern Hurtgen is a quiet place. The forest regrew. The trees, once shattered and burned, stand tall again. Hiking trails wind through the woodland. Tourists visit the area, largely unaware of its history. A few small memorials mark key sites. A plaque here, a monument there. But there's no grand museum, no visitor center, no Hollywood movie. Hurtgen is forgotten, except by those who were there and those who study it. The forest floor, if you know where to look, still shows scars. Craters, now softened by time, dimple the ground. Rusted shell casings poke through leaves. Bunkers, overgrown with moss, hide in hillsides. And every year, ordnance disposal teams detonate unexploded shells found by hikers or construction crews. The forest remembers, even if we don't. For the veterans, Hurtgen became a defining trauma. Reunions of divisions that fought there, the 9th, 28th, 4th, were marked by silence. Men didn't share war stories. They didn't laugh about close calls. They sat quietly, drank, and left early. One veteran, interviewed for a documentary in 2004, said, "People ask me about the war. I tell them about Normandy, about liberating towns in France. But I don't talk about Hurtgen, because Hurtgen wasn't war. It was horror, and there's nothing to say about it. You were there, or you weren't. If you were, you understand. If you weren't, You can't. That silence speaks volumes. Hurtgen broke something in the men who fought there. A belief, perhaps, that war has meaning, that sacrifice serves a purpose. In Hurtgen, the purpose was obscure, the sacrifice was immense, and the outcome was irrelevant. That's a hard truth to carry. The lessons of Hurtgen were eventually learned, but at terrible cost. The U.S. Army recognized that terrain matters, that attacking into enemy strengths is folly, that objectives must be weighed against cost. These seem obvious now, but in autumn 1944, doctrine emphasized offensive action, momentum, aggression. The assumption was that superior resources, more men, more tanks, more planes, would overwhelm any defense. Hurtgen proved that wrong. In certain terrain, defenders hold overwhelming advantages, and no amount of resources can overcome geography. Modern military doctrine reflects Hurtgen's lessons. Avoid fighting in urban or heavily wooded terrain when possible. When unavoidable, use overwhelming firepower and specialized units. Never attack piecemeal. Never reinforce failure. These principles are now taught at West Point, at staff colleges, in doctrine manuals. They were written in the blood of the men who died in Hurtgen. 33,000 teachers. The tuition was steep. What if Hurtgen had been bypassed? What if American commanders, upon encountering fierce resistance in mid-September, had pulled back and found another route to the Ruhr dams? The answer is unknowable, but speculation is instructive. Bypassing Hurtgen would have preserved 9 divisions from attrition, 33,000 casualties avoided. Those divisions would have been available in December, when the Battle of the Bulge erupted. The Bulge might have been contained faster, with less cost. Or perhaps the Germans, not needing to defend Hurtgen, would have been stronger in the Ardennes. Perhaps the Bulge would have been worse. We can't know, but we can know this. The men who died in Hurtgen died for an objective that was ultimately bypassed. That fact haunts military historians, because it suggests their deaths were preventable, not heroic sacrifices in a necessary battle, but casualties of strategic error. That's a hard legacy to bear. Private First Class Paul Bulge survived Hurtgen. He fought through the Bulge. He saw the war's end in Germany. He returned home to Texas, married, raised a family. He lived to 93, dying in 2013. But Hurtgen never left him. In his memoir, published in 1993, he wrote, "I dream of the forest. Not nightmares, just the forest, the trees, the silence, the men I knew who are still there, under the leaves. I don't tell my children about Hurtgen. What would I say? That their father survived a battle that accomplished nothing? That their father watched friends die for yards of mud? That their father questions, even now, whether any of it mattered? No, I don't tell them. I just dream." Bulge's words capture the essence of Hurtgen. It was a battle without glory, without clear purpose, without redemption. It was simply men dying because orders said attack. And the men who survived carry that weight forever. The forest is quiet now. The trees have returned. The trails are peaceful. Hikers walk where soldiers died. Children play where men screamed. Time has healed the land, but time does not erase history. Beneath the soil lie bones. Beneath the leaves lie shell casings. Beneath the silence lies the echo of 33,000 casualties. The longest battle ever fought by the United States Army. A battle that should never have happened. A battle that accomplished nothing. A battle that killed a small city's worth of men for 50 square miles of trees. Hurtgen Forest. Remember the name. Remember the cost. And remember the lesson. Not every objective is worth the price.